Hello world history students, and welcome back. This is the last part of our unit, the Cold War and Decolonization. Here we are talking about the life and end of the Cold War. How was life like in the Western world and also in Asia? So let's talk about it. So let's start with China. So during the Cold War, or towards the end of World War II, there was two Chinese governments that existed in China: the Nationalist Party that was led by Chiang Kai-shek, and then the Communist Party that was led by Mao Zedong. Eventually, a civil war broke between the two parties in China, and by 1949, Mao Zedong was able to gain control of China and establish a communist system in China. Now that Mao Zedong is the leader of China, he initiates what's called the Great Leap Forward, which was a transition to a socialist society. And he did that by collectivizing farmland and nationalizing industry. So that means that he basically collected a lot of private farming from private citizens under the government, and also started to allow the government to own the industries, the main industries of China. He aimed to try to boost the economy of China, but it failed because of bad weather, peasant resistance, and then a decrease in food production. So although he had an aim to try to better China and boost their economy, the Great Leap Forward did not work, or it wasn't successful. The Cultural Revolution was an idea that he launched for permanent revolution in China, culturally speaking. So a lot of murals were painted, and just a lot of things were established in terms of you could say propaganda per se, or mass media in that instance, to persuade Chinese citizens that the Cultural Revolution was there. He also initiated or promoted his ideology, or his cultural ideology, in what was called the Little Red Book, and he initiated what was called the Red Guards, as you see here. Their aim, and even they were children at some instances, and their aim was to eliminate capitalist influences. Even though his goal was to have a classless society, meaning no high class, no low class, no middle class, that was his goal. He found that to be very challenging, and the Cultural Revolution ended with his death in 1976. So how did the Cold War end in China? Well, China and the Soviet Union alliance severed because of these two reasons. One, they were not getting enough economic aid from the Soviet Union, of course, because the Soviet Union was not able to bounce back that effectively after World War II. But also the Chinese wanted to go on their own way to promote their own world revolution, establish themselves as an independent world power. So because of the threat that they were facing from the Soviet Union on their northern border, they decided to improve their relations with the United States, and that's when Richard Nixon came in to visit China in 1972, and they established some form of diplomatic ties. By the 1990s, the Chinese and Soviet Union's relationship improved, and now China is seen as an independent world power. The United States and China's relationship today isn't that good, but there's room for improvement. So let's talk about the life and end of the Cold War in the United States. So remember that Lyndon B. Johnson did not seek a second term after his handling and his misfortune. Just the way he handled the Vietnam War was not good all the way around. So he did not seek another term as president. However, the former Vice President Richard M. Nixon was elected as the new president. However, it was found that he was using illegal methods in order to gain information about his opponents during his campaign, his presidential campaign. That led to what was called the Watergate scandal. After he lied to the American public saying that he wasn't involved, and they found out that he was involved through secret tapes of his conversations, impeachment query and an impeachment proceeding was put in place. He was impeached in the Senate, not the House, but rather facing full impeachment and removal from office, he resigned from office in 1974. So here we have James E. Carter, or Jimmy Carter, who became the 39th president of the United States after Gerald Ford, Gerald Ford was the 8th president who came in after Nixon resigned, right? However, Jimmy Carter's legacy or his presidency was marred because of the Iranian crisis, where Ayatollah Khomeini held 52 Americans hostage. Remember, we talked about that with the Middle East situation, or decolonization in the Middle East. Carter's inability to release those American hostages in Tehran in the embassy cost him his 1980 election. Now, there was an issue in the United States at the same time, or during this Cold War period, where there was a big fear about communism spreading to the United States. And this climate of fear was really instigated by this guy here, the U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. And he pointed fingers, basically, especially people that was in high government positions, and pointed to them as communists with no evidence to say that they were communists or not. And that theory or that practice is now called McCarthyism. He went as far as attacking communist conspirators in the U.S. Army and condemning people in the Senate. Going that far, his anti-communist crusades quickly ended, and he was condemned by the Senate in 1954 because of his accusations towards these groups. So as you see here, after World War II, during the 1960s, early 70s, a lot of things were happening internally in the United States. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. Dr. Martin Luther King led his march on Washington calling for racial and economic equality. Lyndon B. Johnson was facing a lot of challenges with his Great Society platform, and even with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, that sparked a lot of riots and racial division. With Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that quelled a lot, and also of the Voting Rights Act. Also, a lot of anti-war protests against the Vietnam War was going on. So there was a lot of things happening in the United States during this time. The women liberation movement was in full swing, where women's lives were improved, and that led to the Equal Pay Act of 1963 as well. So now at this point, we're talking about the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. Let's say the 80s. And the new president here is Ronald Reagan. And he establishes a new structure of government and trying to do what is called a top-down trickle effect of the economy. Now you have the economy, or the society shifts from a rural community to more urbanized community, and more farmers are being reduced, and you have more industrial and more white-collar workers and a more middle class, right? Which led to a consumer economy. However, U.S.-Soviet relationships slowly improved, and Reagan initiated a significant military buildup to counter communist expansion. Because of his initiating that military buildup, that strained the U.S. economy, and that had to lead to budget deficits, even though he was describing this top-down, trickle-down economy that he was trying to do, called Reaganomics. You'll learn more about that in U.S. history. So let's talk about life in Western Europe. Charles de Gaulle of France was the new prime minister or president after World War II. And as you see here, he drafted a new constitution for the Fifth Republic, and he wanted France to be a big world power again. De Gaulle invested heavily in nuclear arms, and France was able to launch its first nuclear weapon in 1960. François Mitterrand of France came into power after de Gaulle died, and as a socialist, he tried to put in measures to help workers, okay? So increasing the minimum age, having 39-hour work weeks, and higher taxes for the rich. So he saw the government and tried to nationalize and take over major banks and major industrial systems like the steel industry, space, and electronic technologies. And a lot of his socialist programs are going to stay in power for, up until 1993. So in Germany, the finance minister saw a revival of Western Germany, and he will succeed as the new German chancellor. Willy Brandt will become the leader of Germany in 1963 as a social democrat, and he will receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts of trying to normalize ties or trying to unify the issues that were happening between West and East Germany, because remember that was split in half during a little after World War II. So let's talk about Great Britain. Margaret Thatcher was the first female British Prime Minister and implemented what is called Thatcherism to Great Britain, which was to limit social welfare, restrict union power, and boost business investment, right? So as I mentioned, her economic policy was called Thatcherism. However, her popularity died because of some of the business investment principles that she put in place did not succeed, and that led to her resignation in 1990. Also in the Western Europe, as you see here, we had the establishment of what was called the European Economic Community, or the EEC, or the Common Market, and that was meant to create a free trade area with no trade barriers among any of those 6 nations involved. Okay, but also the European Union was also put in place. The European Union was established as a successor to the European Community with the implementation of a treaty of the European Union. So the European Union was basically a union of all of these European nations as one entity, and its main job was to prevent economic challenges by working together with other European nations, right? Also to eliminate high employment and bring prosperity to all of these European nations. One of the primary objectives of the European Union was to introduce a unified currency for Europe, or all of Western Europe, called the euro, which is still in place today. Most countries except for Great Britain also uses the euro as a monetary system. Now this signifies the end of the fall of communism. One of the things that occurred, remember we talked about the Iron Curtain as a euphemism or a symbol for the Berlin Wall. Remember, we had East Germany, and a lot of East Germans were experiencing anti-communist beliefs and protests, and many of them were fleeing to West Germany's borders, or Western Berlin, right? So thousands, as you see here, of East Germans immediately crossed over to West Germany to reunite with long separated family members and friends when the Berlin Wall collapsed and was taken down. This was seen as a symbol of the end of the Cold War period, and by that time, by October 1990, there was a unification of Germany as one country. Also during this time period, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was established. This was an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to reduce barriers to trade. And it was supposed to make trade much easier between these 3 countries and more profitable. However, some Canadians felt that the trade agreement benefited the United States more than it did Canada or Mexico. In Eastern Europe, many of these Eastern European countries struggled with their independence. Mainly so, many of them fell to satellite control or puppet states of the Soviet Union, right? And many of them struggled to maintain their independence from the Soviet Union. One of these countries, as you see here, was Yugoslavia with Josip Broz, and he maintained his independence and resisted Soviet control up until the 1980s. Many of these states, they were dependent heavily on collectivized agriculture. They dealt with censorship and repression because of Soviet policies. As you see here in Poland and Hungary, the leader tried to implement reforms. However, they were under Soviet threats, right? Hungary declared their independence from the USSR, but the USSR responded with a military invasion. And in similar fashion, the Soviet Union then went into Czechoslovakia, which was called the Prague Spring, which you see here, and those were protests of the Prague Spring. The Czech leader, Dubček, tried to democratize the government, but the USSR, the Soviet Union, crushed that reform movement and just reestablished the order in Czechoslovakia. So military support to communist governments of Eastern Europe ended as a result, and mostly a peaceful revolution occurred and swept through Eastern Europe. In Poland, there was demands for change, and a worker named Lech Walesa organized a trade union called Solidarity. And because of that, that led to free parliamentary elections and ended 45 years of communist rule in Poland. Right? And the same thing came out of Czechoslovakia, but it was more repression in this case, because Czechoslovakia saw communist resistance leading to the government's collapse. So eventually, Czechoslovakia fought back there and resisted against, communist or the Soviet occupation. So eventually the country peacefully divided into two different countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And by that time, in 1980, 1990, the Czech Republic was able to thrive economically speaking, and Slovakia as well. Romania also ended their communism, but it was very violent, as you see. Thousands were killed by the secret police. The army refused to support repression, and a lot of it ended in violence, and eventually it led to a new government. But there was still communist occupation and power until 1996. Let's talk about Yugoslavia and Serbia after the Cold War. In Yugoslavia, once Broz died, or Tito died, the Communism Party collapsed. But this made way for a new Serbian leader called Slobodan Milošević. Milošević was very harsh. The Serbian-dominated Yugoslavian army, as you see here, attacked and continued conflicts with neighboring groups such as Bosnia and Herzegovina. Then Serbia initiated and launched a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing to remove Bosnians from Serbia, many of them who were Muslim from Serbia. By 1995, NATO had to step in and have an intervention to end the violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. By 2008, all 6 of the old Yugoslavic republics were now independent. And then Milosevic was placed on trial in an international tribunal for his ethnic cleansing crimes. Okay? So let's talk about life in the Soviet Union. Remember, we talked about Joseph Stalin and the way he ruled the Soviet Union and changed it into a communist socialist, a strong, centralized communist socialist republic. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, worked to repeal repression and the terror of Stalin's regime, and that process became known as de-Stalinization. He loosened up censorship under his leadership and also tried to increase the production of agriculture and consumer goods. But his so-called, or his, in the eyes of the Soviets, his failed attempt at the Cuban Missile Crisis was the final straw, and he was forced out of office in 1964. After Nikita Khrushchev was Brezhnev, and he led the Soviet Union in the 1970s. He called for improved relations with the United States and also called for what is called détente. Détente is nuclear arms limitation treaties, okay? So basically détente is a French word to limit or to, scale down. So they're talking now about scaling down their nuclear arms missiles. So détente collapsed in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to restore a pro-Soviet regime in Afghanistan. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the Middle East. And in protest of the invasion in Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, the United States boycotted the Olympic Games in Moscow and stopped shipping grain to the Soviet Union. But this also launched a new arms race between the Afghan rebels in Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, trying to, establish control in Afghanistan. And by that time, towards the end of the 1980s and towards the beginning of the 1990s, this new leader of the Soviet Union, his name was Mikhail Gorbachev, he comes in to really reform the Soviet Union. And he launches what is called perestroika, which allows for more private business ownership, and glasnost to have encouraged discussion about changing policies in the Soviet Union. Eventually, those reforms that he puts in place, perestroika and glasnost, leads to the end of the Cold War and the dissolvement of the Soviet Union as a communist nation, and they revert back to what is called the Russian Federation in 1991. So that ends our unit with the Cold War. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.